For the past 3 years I've been doing PhD research in art history. I've written 80,000 words, but I want to spend 5 minutes or so explaining the title. It starts with the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard. He died in 1998 and is most famous for his writings on the postmodern, which were much discussed in the 1980s, but I want to go back to his earlier writings on art, particularly those from the 1971 book Discours Figure. So Lyotard and the Figaro, an idea from this book Discours Figure in 1971. It's a term I've been struggling with over the last 3 years, and to some extent it's indefinable. So I'm going to pause a little and come back to this in a couple of minutes. First of all, just finish my title. Lyotard and the Figaro. In performance, art and writing. Lyotard wrote a lot about art and thought a lot about the interrelationship between writing and art, writing as a philosopher about art and what it meant and what the task was in writing about art, usually translating between media. The approach he takes is what drew me to think about Lyotard, because he's very humble in his approach, continually questioning himself as to what is the function of what he's doing and what's driving him to do that. He writes less about performance and performance art, and that's where I hope that my thesis begins to work. Because I argue that by looking at the way that Lyotard approaches art and the thoughts he has in relation to art and writing have a pertinence for us when we think about performance, and particularly the relationship between performance art and its documentation, whether through photography or writing. And I found Lyotard's thinking around the Figaro really useful for reflecting on this interrelationship between performance art and documentation. So I'll just say a little bit more about the performance art that I'm referring to. I'm referring to performance art in its contemporary sense, that which grew out of the crucible of the late 1960s and early 70s. And so it's no surprise that the three figures who appear in my thesis are Vito Acconci from the US, Italian-born Gina Pan, who spent most of her life in France, and perhaps the grande dame of performance art, Marina Abramović. The work of theirs that I've chosen to talk about in the thesis is that relates to my thinking about the role of documentation in performance art and questions around performance art history. Marina Abramović, most recently in 2005, has been doing re-performances of early work by people including Vito Acconci, Gina Pan, and re-performing her own work as well. Vito Acconci was a poet before he started working in performance, and the way that he uses spoken language, which comes down to us as written text, is a useful residue, allows us a way into thinking about this work that was performed in the past but can still exist for us in the present. Gina Pan is quite unusual for artists at this period because she considered those elements that we usually refer to as documentation, whether it's photography, sketches, writings that take place after the performance or are produced in preparation for the performance. She actually gives those as much emphasis as the live actions themselves. And so I take her ideas as a jumping off point for our own approach to performance art today, in arguing that performance art documentation, or that which is usually considered documentation, can actually be a way into experience that which is regarded as important about performance. And what it is that's important about performance can be understood or can be approached usefully by thinking through some of the ideas that come from the way that Lyotard deals with this term, the figural. So I'm going to close by just trying to explain a little bit further the figural. The figural is a force that disturbs and disrupts established forms of communication, disturbs and disrupts attempts to establish and systematise meaning, whether through codes, language or discourse. It's indefinable. It's neither a thing nor an object, but the figural is an operation, a process of working through. And the figural it's good. It's good for thinking about performance because it's never the same, it shifts, it is ephemeral, and it can't be caught. The figural is also unstable. Unstable and unsustainable as a method. Because it continually forces you to question your presuppositions and makes you aware of that which cannot be put into language. Unsustainable as a method. The figural makes our reactions to art, writing and performance particularly important, and this isn't a celebration of merely subjective responses, but rather asking us to pay attention to what unsettles and disturbs our expectations, to make us aware of our accustomed reactions. And this is not necessarily related to shock, and this is important to say in relation to performance art, when so all too often our expectations are about shock. What's more in keeping with the figural, I think, is a reaction of ambivalence, where we find ourselves unsure how to react, when we incur a tension that's almost physical. Lyotard uses a little phrase from Kant to describe this feeling as one of mental agitation, to describe the visceral breakdown of usual forms of thinking and reacting, and one that emphasises the temporal dimension of hesitation. Now I could end this little poem with a return to Lyotard, but I'd rather, and somewhat problematically, want to propose instead the term loss, because loss is the result of this ambivalence, this agitation, a loss of control, a loss of knowing how to proceed, not a loss like melancholia or mourning, not a romantic search for a past utopia, a past whole, but as an imperative to search for that which is hidden, but which can't be shown. An imperative to search for that which is hidden, can't be shown, but rather must be felt.